In medieval Europe, execution was never meant to be quick. Death itself was not considered the true punishment. Suffering was. Pain was carefully extended, measured, and displayed, because the purpose of execution was not only to end a life, but to educate the living. To understand why some executions lasted for days, we must abandon modern ideas of justice and enter a world where fear was the foundation of order. Public execution functioned as a form of governance. The scaffold was not merely a place of death, but a stage where power was demonstrated openly. Kings, nobles, and magistrates understood that authority weakened when it was invisible. Therefore, punishment had to be seen, heard, and remembered. The longer a condemned person remained alive while suffering, the longer the lesson lingered in the minds of the crowd. In medieval legal philosophy, crime was not viewed as an individual moral failure alone. Many offenses were believed to threaten the entire social structure. Treason endangered the crown. Heresy endangered God's favor. Rebellion endangered stability itself. When a crime was perceived as existential, the punishment had to be extraordinary. Swift execution was considered insufficient. The criminal had to be unmade slowly. France in the 14th century provides some of the clearest examples of prolonged execution as ritual. Chroniclers describe punishments that unfolded over several days, following strict sequences. On the first day, the condemned was humiliated rather than injured. Stripped of clothing, bound with ropes, and paraded through streets and marketplaces, the accused became a living symbol of betrayal. The public was encouraged to mock, curse, and throw refuse. This stage was psychological. The body survived, but dignity did not. At night, the prisoner was returned to confinement. This was intentional. Survival was required. The punishment was not a single act, but a process. On the second day, physical suffering began. Heated pincers tore flesh from arms, chest, and thighs. Executioners were highly skilled professionals. They knew how to cause extreme pain while avoiding fatal wounds. Bleeding was controlled. Shock was prevented. Death was postponed. By the third day, the condemned was often barely conscious, yet still responsive. Bells rang in the morning to summon the public. Attendance was expected. In some towns, absence from executions could raise suspicion. Children were brought by their parents, not out of cruelty but instruction. Authority was being taught. Within the Holy Roman Empire, prolonged executions reached levels of calculated brutality rarely matched elsewhere. Breaking on the wheel was among the most feared sentences. Contrary to popular imagination, this punishment did not necessarily kill quickly. Victims were bound to a wooden wheel elevated above the ground. The executioner shattered bones systematically, often beginning with the legs, then the arms, and finally the torso. Vital organs were deliberately avoided. In many cases, the condemned was left alive on the wheel after the breaking was complete. The body, twisted and broken, remained exposed to the elements. Chroniclers record victims surviving for days, sometimes longer. They screamed until their voices failed, then whispered, then breathed silently. Death came slowly through dehydration, exposure, infection, or internal bleeding. Birds pecked at open wounds. This was not hidden. It was the point. Religion did not oppose these practices. Medieval theology framed suffering as purification. Earthly pain was believed to cleanse sin and prepare the soul for judgment. Priests stood beside scaffolds, urging confession and repentance. The condemned was encouraged to accept suffering as divine will. In this way, prolonged execution became both punishment and sacrament. The Church also benefited from delay. A living prisoner could confess repeatedly. Each confession reinforced the legitimacy of authority. Pain extracted truth, or at least the appearance of truth. The crowd heard admissions spoken through agony, transforming suffering into propaganda. Witch trials added another dimension to prolonged death. Burning at the stake is often imagined as instantaneous. In reality, many victims did not die quickly. Fires were poorly constructed or intentionally controlled. Victims could suffocate slowly from smoke, or burn gradually from the feet upward. In some recorded cases, the condemned survived the first burning attempt and were returned to prison, only to be burned again days later. In certain regions, executioners strangled victims before burning them. Elsewhere, mercy was seen as weakness. The longer the witch suffered, the stronger the proof that the verdict was righteous. Pain validated belief. Executioners themselves occupied a strange position in medieval society. They were essential to the maintenance of order, yet deeply despised by the very communities they served. Their work was considered necessary but morally contaminating. Many lived on the edges of towns, separated from ordinary citizens. Their presence tolerated only because fear depended on their skill. The role of executioner was rarely chosen. In many cases, it was inherited. Sons learned the craft from their fathers, not through books, but through observation and repetition. They learned where to cut, how deeply to strike, and most importantly, how to keep a condemned person alive while inflicting unbearable pain. Precision mattered. An execution that ended too quickly was seen as failure. Despite their isolation, executioners wielded a form of power. They controlled the boundary between life and death. In prolonged executions, this control was absolute. A slight adjustment of pressure, a delayed strike, or a carefully placed wound could extend suffering by hours or days. This knowledge transformed execution from a crude act into a calculated process. The public rarely understood the technical skill involved. What they saw was spectacle, but behind the spectacle was experience. Executioners knew how the human body responded to trauma. They understood which bones could be broken without causing fatal bleeding, which muscles could be torn without inducing shock, and how exposure could be used as a weapon. Death was not the goal, endurance was. Crowds gathered early on execution days. Market stalls appeared near scaffolds. Food, drink, and souvenirs were sold. Public punishment became an event woven into daily life. Attendance was not always voluntary. In some regions, authorities expected citizens to witness executions as proof of loyalty. Absence could invite suspicion. As the condemned was brought forward, reactions varied. Some spectators shouted insults, others prayed, some watched in silence. The execution created a shared emotional experience, binding the crowd together through fear, relief, or grim fascination. This collective witnessing reinforced authority more effectively than any written law. Children were frequently present. Parents believed exposure would teach obedience. Fear learned early was believed to last a lifetime. The image of a suffering body became a lesson carried into adulthood, shaping behavior long after the execution ended. Occasionally, executions failed. A rope snapped. A fire burned unevenly. A victim survived longer than intended. When this happened, crowds reacted unpredictably. Some demanded mercy. Others demanded greater cruelty. Authorities feared sympathy more than violence. Compassion threatened the narrative of justice. In rare cases, public unrest forced officials to intervene. Executions were halted. Sentences were altered. These moments revealed the fragility of power. Fear worked best when perfectly controlled. Too much suffering could provoke doubt. Too little could invite defiance. By the late medieval period, such tensions began to accumulate. The spectacle that once unified communities began to divide them. Executioners became symbols not only of justice, but of excess. The same practices that enforced order now risked undermining it. Authorities responded to these tensions by refining the spectacle. Executions became more structured, more ritualized, and more tightly controlled. Every movement was planned. The route to the scaffold, the timing of announcements, and even the order of punishments were designed to guide the emotional response of the crowd. Fear had to be visible but not chaotic. Legal records from the 15th century reveal an increasing concern with public perception. Magistrates debated not only what punishment was deserved, but how it would be received. A punishment that inspired pity was dangerous. One that inspired boredom was worse. The ideal execution maintained attention while reinforcing hierarchy. This concern extended to the condemned themselves. Prisoners were coached on how to behave. Displays of defiance were punished. Displays of repentance were encouraged. A weeping, submissive body reinforced authority far more effectively than a silent one. The performance of guilt mattered as much as guilt itself. In some regions, officials delayed executions deliberately to build anticipation. Notices were posted days in advance. Rumors spread. The waiting period intensified fear. By the time the execution occurred, the crowd was already emotionally prepared. The suffering that followed confirmed expectations rather than shocking them. Yet anticipation also allowed empathy to grow. As prisoners waited, families visited. Confessions circulated, stories emerged. The condemned became human again. This was a problem. When the crowd recognized itself in the victim, fear weakened, sympathy crept in. Authorities attempted to counter this by emphasizing monstrosity. Crimes were exaggerated. Confessions were rewritten. Accused witches were described as inhuman. Traitors were portrayed as enemies of God. Dehumanization made prolonged suffering acceptable. Pain inflicted on a monster did not provoke mercy. Despite these efforts, cracks appeared. Some crowds grew restless. Murmurs replaced cheers. In rare instances, spectators intervened physically, cutting ropes or extinguishing fires. These acts were dangerous, often punished severely, but they revealed a shifting moral landscape. Executioners, caught between authority and crowd, became increasingly isolated. Their role required obedience to law and resistance to emotion. A moment of hesitation could be interpreted as weakness or treason. Precision remained their shield. Skill protected them when sympathy could not. By the early 16th century, the effectiveness of prolonged execution as spectacle was being questioned openly. Pamphlets circulated. Scholars argued that cruelty corrupted society. Pain, they claimed, did not produce obedience, but resentment. Fear, once absolute, was becoming unstable. These debates did not end executions overnight. Change came slowly. But the idea that suffering should have limits began to take hold. What had once been unquestionable was now contested. The scaffold, once a symbol of certainty, became a site of doubt. This growing unease set the stage for transformation. The same practices that had sustained medieval authority were now undermining it. Public punishment was losing its power to unify through fear. A new era was approaching, one in which justice would be hidden rather than displayed. The collapse of public execution as unquestioned authority did not happen suddenly. It unfolded through individual lives, recorded in fragments across legal archives and eyewitness accounts. These were not abstract debates, but human stories where prolonged punishment produced consequences no law had anticipated. One such case occurred in early 16th century Germany, when a man accused of banditry was sentenced to breaking on the wheel. The execution followed traditional procedure, but the condemned survived far longer than expected. For 2 days he remained alive, exposed above the city gate. His cries echoed through the streets at night, reaching homes far from the scaffold. What had once inspired fear now produced exhaustion and unease. Residents complained. Sleep was disrupted. Children cried. The suffering that was meant to instruct had become intrusive. Authorities eventually ordered the executioner to end the man's life early, not out of mercy, but necessity. This decision, quietly recorded, marked a shift. Control mattered more than cruelty. Other cases revealed similar tensions. In France, a woman accused of poisoning was burned slowly due to damp wood and weak fire. She remained conscious far longer than expected, praying loudly. Her voice unsettled the crowd. Witnesses later reported that the prayers, not the flames, lingered in memory. What should have erased sympathy instead amplified it. Executioners bore the weight of these failures. Their reputations depended on precision. A prolonged death was acceptable only when it followed expectation. When suffering exceeded the script, it became dangerous. Executioners were blamed, fined, or dismissed. Skill could no longer guarantee protection. Some executioners adapted by ending lives sooner than prescribed. This quiet mercy, illegal but tolerated, spread unevenly. Records suggest that by the mid-16th century, many prolonged executions ended earlier than law demanded. Official rituals remained, but their substance eroded. At the same time, new ideas about the body and pain emerged. Medical knowledge expanded. Scholars began to describe suffering not as purification, but as physiological response. Pain became measurable. This language weakened theological justifications. If suffering was mechanical rather than moral, its meaning changed. Governments noticed. Punishment shifted gradually away from public spaces. Executions moved behind walls. The crowd was removed from the equation. Authority no longer relied on spectacle alone. Surveillance, bureaucracy, and imprisonment began to replace terror as tools of control. Yet memory did not fade easily. Generations who had witnessed prolonged executions carried those images forward. Fear did not vanish, it transformed. It became quieter, internalized, less visible. The scaffold disappeared, but its lessons remained. Stage 3 does not conclude with abolition or Enlightenment triumph. It ends with transition. Prolonged execution did not vanish because it was cruel. It vanished because it became ineffective. Fear, once carefully engineered, had turned unstable. The world that followed would develop new forms of control, subtler and less visible, but no less powerful. The age of public suffering closed, not with a final scream, but with silence. As public executions retreated from view, their legacy embedded itself into institutions rather than spectacles. Prisons expanded. Legal procedures grew more complex. Punishment became slower, quieter, and less visible, but it did not become gentler. The violence once displayed in public squares was redistributed across time and bureaucracy. Former executioners adapted or vanished. Some were absorbed into prison systems as wardens or guards. Others disappeared from records entirely. Their skills, once central to authority, were no longer publicly celebrated or condemned. The state no longer needed visible specialists in pain. Control had evolved. Historical records from the 17th century reveal a growing discomfort with detailed descriptions of suffering. Chroniclers shortened accounts. Official documents removed sensory language. What had once been narrated vividly was now summarized coldly. Silence replaced spectacle. Yet the moral questions raised by prolonged execution did not disappear. Philosophers revisited them under new language. Cruelty was reframed as inefficiency. Pain was criticized not because it was immoral, but because it failed to produce stable obedience. The argument shifted from ethics to utility. This reframing allowed societies to distance themselves from their past without fully rejecting it. The brutality of earlier centuries was labeled primitive. Progress was claimed. But the mechanisms of fear persisted, transformed rather than erased. In some regions, echoes of prolonged execution survived in public punishments that stopped short of death. Whipping posts, pillories, and forced labor carried forward the logic of exposure and endurance. Pain was reduced, but humiliation remained. Memory was still the target. The disappearance of the scaffold also altered the relationship between people and power. Authority became abstract. Laws were enforced through paperwork, surveillance, and confinement. The absence of spectacle made power harder to see, but not easier to escape. Modern societies often imagine themselves as distant from medieval cruelty. Yet the desire to witness punishment has not vanished. It has shifted forms. Courtrooms, media trials, and public shaming reflect the same impulse to transform individual suffering into collective reassurance. The medieval execution that took days no longer exists, but its logic survives. Fear remains a tool. Control remains the objective. Only the methods have changed. What began as a lesson carved into flesh ended as a system etched into institutions. The scaffold fell silent, but the structure it supported endured. This is not an ending of redemption. It is an ending of transformation. The past did not disappear. It reorganized itself.